Good afternoon, everyone. Very welcome to today's Our Studies Research Seminar, whether you're joining us online through Teams or in the room. I'm delighted to welcome our visiting speaker for this afternoon, who is Dr. Luca Crispi, who is Associate Professor of James Joyce Studies and Modernism in the School of English, Drama and Film, and in the UCD Centre for Research in James Joyce Studies. His monograph, Joyce's Creative Process and the Construction of Characters in Ulysses, Becoming the Blooms, was published by OUP in 2015. He's a founding co-editor with Anne Fogarty of the Dublin James Joyce Journal and was co-director of the Dublin James Joyce Summer School and a board member of the International James Joyce Foundation. He was the co-editor with Catherine Fahy of Joyce Studies 2004 series and with Sam Slote of How Joyce Wrote Finnegans Wake, a chapter-by-chapter genetic guide with Wisconsin University Press in 2007. He's currently working on a monograph entitled The Genesis of Ulysses, and recently edited with Alexis and Anne Léon, a collection of archival material entitled James Joyce and Paul Léon, the story of a friendship revisited, published by Bloomsbury in 2022. And that's the subject that Luca's going to talk to us about today, the friendship between James Joyce and Paul Léon, a friendship at work. So, you're very welcome. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. And firstly, thank you very much to Peter and to Margaret for inviting me here. I'm very pleased to be here. I will give some background first. I was working on a large project. I thought about writing a biography of Joyce's final decade. And to do that, I needed to know more about Paul Léon. For those of you who are familiar with Richard Ellman's monumental biography of Joyce, the last 10 years of Joyce's life take up a very small part of the biography as a whole, about 100 pages. That's because Ellman and everyone else didn't have access to the huge treasure trove of documents that were in the National Library of Ireland, which only opened in 1992 after a 50-year embargo. And I'll tell you more about that story later. So as I was working on the biography, fleshing out Joyce's life over 10 years, I realized how large a role Paul Léon played in Joyce's life during that time. And I kept finding more and more documentary evidence about Paul Léon. Some people recognize the name Paul Léon, and some people even know that he had something to do with James Joyce, but they usually have a vague notion of it. What I realized was that there was a lot more to be said, a lot more to be discovered about Paul Léon. So I paused my project and focused my energies on gathering together some archival material about Paul Léon, and it came together in a volume for Bloomsbury's Modernist Archives series. And this obviously grew straight out of that work. Let's begin. In her memoir, A Story of a Friendship, Paul Léon's wife wrote, James Joyce and Paul Léon met in 1928. It was the beginning of a friendship that was to last 12 years and would have certainly continued indefinitely had they lived. Joyce was 47 years old and my husband 35 at the time of their first meeting. But differences in age and early background did not prove a barrier to their understanding of each other. They met through my brother Alec, who had been giving Joyce Russian lessons after meeting him at the home of an American friend who later married Joyce's son, Giorgio. Knowing the interest of both men, my brother arranged a meeting. I was in England at the time and received a letter from my husband. Wait till you see him, he wrote. I returned to Paris to find their daily program already established. They were to see each other almost every day thereafter, days in which they worked together and days in which their selfless friendship was created. Paul Leopoldovich Léon was born on 25 April 1893 in St. Petersburg, Russia. Like many of his peers, he had a multilingual education, and then went on to study in the law faculty of the city's Imperial University, where he earned a first-class degree in 1915. As fate would have it, Paul spent the next year writing a thesis on home rule in Ireland, a subject that he and Joyce would have been eager to discuss in the dozen or so years of their friendship. Paul's doctoral studies were cut short when he was mobilized for active military service. But by January 1918, he had returned to his studies, this time at Moscow University. He became an assistant lecturer in constitutional law, but his academic career ended abruptly when he, his family, and so many others fled Russia following the Bolshevik Revolution in November 1918. The Léons traveled to Finland and Sweden, where they stayed for 5 months. It was here that he first met his future wife, Elizabeth Lucy Ponisovsky. The Léon family arrived in London in April 1919, and Paul quickly entered the intellectual circles there, collaborating with the distinguished librarian at the London Library, Sir Charles Hagberg Wright. Paul and Lucy married on 26 July 1920 in Kensington Town Hall. 2 weeks later, they moved to Paris, along with most of their extended families, settling in the city for the rest of their lives. In 1926 and 1927, Paul obtained the required diplomas to pursue a doctorate in law in France, while at the same time contributing to journals in London and Paris, including studies on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, on whom he would become an internationally renowned authority. In 1928, Simon Kra, publishers in Paris, issued 2 of Paul's works in French. The first was his edited notes on a 1905 translation of the letters of Madame de Staël to Benjamin Constant, another of Léon's special fields of study. The other book was an edition of the letters of Tsar Nicholas II to his mother. Paul and Joyce became fast friends at the beginning of that same year. Although no letters between them survived before 1930, we know that their work together began in earnest in 1929, while Joyce was preparing his latest work-in-progress fragment, Haveth Childers Everywhere, for press. Joyce's notebooks and his work-in-progress manuscripts, as well as the letters and the recollections of his other friends, in their roles as Joyce's researchers and amanuenses, can help us to recreate a fairly vivid picture of what it must have been like to be part of the workforce that the taxing writer assembled around him to prepare his newest work-in-progress fragment for publication. In November 1929, Joyce had Sylvia Beach write to another of Joyce's publishers, offering him Haveth Childers Everywhere. On Joyce's instructions, she presented one of the clearest statements of the writer's rationale for his latest work. She wrote, "It is entrusted to the voice of the Viking father of Dublin City. On account of the self-glorifying tone of old Eirikur, the format should be gaudy and aggressive within artistic limits." At the start of 1930, Joyce enlisted the assistance of Paul and several others to help him construct the story of Humphrey Chimpton Eirikur, the male protagonist of his story, who was also a city builder. Joyce was physically unable to read and write sufficiently well to complete the piece he was working on, so he relied on his troupe of assistants, Paul Léon, Lucia Joyce, his daughter, Porrick Collum, Stuart Gilbert, as well as his daughter-in-law, to read to him, to take notes, and write out the additions and changes that he wanted made to the text. As always, Joyce took inspiration from his notebooks as he continued to revise and amplify the texts on several typescripts. In a diary entry for 31 January 1930, Stuart Gilbert gives us an embittered sense of what the regime was like. At last, JJ has recommenced work on Work in Progress. The deluxe edition by, who knows, soon to come out. About the old lady, ALP, I think. Another about the city, HCE, Building Dublin. 5 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on his sofa. He has made a list of 30 towns, New York, Vienna, Budapest, etc. Mrs. Fleischman, that's his daughter-in-law, has read out the articles on some of these. I quote, finish Vienna and read Christiane in Budapest, etc. Whenever I come to a name of a street, suburb, park, etc., I pause. Joyce thinks, if he can anglicize the word, i.e. make a pun on it, Mrs. F records the name in its deformation in the notebook. Thus, Slots Park, I think, at Christiana becomes Sluts Park. He collects all queer names in this way and will soon have a notebook full of them. He is curled on his sofa while I struggle with Danish or Romanian names, pondering puns. Although Stuart Gilbert conflates several events in his account, at least one of the notebook he refers to has survived. While Joyce started off taking notes in the notebook himself, he then relied on whomever was available to continue with the work that needed to be done. Paul assisted Joyce by taking several pages of notes from the entries on Tehran and Rangoon in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Rather than making puns, as Stuart Gilbert claims, most of the notes are usually unexceptional words and phrases taken verbatim from the source text, although sometimes there is already some wordplay evident in the elaboration of the notes. For example, on the one hand, the first word Joyce had Paul note was simply Elburz, which is the name of a mountain range in the hinterlands of Tehran. Then Paul was asked to note enceinte, pregnant in French, though used in the sense of a perimeter wall in the source text. You can see it on the right in the first line. This was the only word Joyce found of interest in the description of the city's architectural history in the encyclopedia entry, which read, in 1869, Nasr ud-Din Shah decided upon enlarging the city. The old wall and towers were demolished. The ditch was filled up and used for building sites, and an enceinte consisting of a ditch and 58 unequal bastions, according to Vauban's first system, was constructed and completed in 1874. So from this dense description in the Encyclopedia Britannica, Joyce just chooses one word, which for some reason he finds of interest. Nonetheless, it is unlikely that most readers coming across, quote, the mighty evil of Roms in ancient Carthage inhabits children everywhere, or in Finnegans Wake, would be able to discern the word's original, quite unusual, though mundane context. On the other hand, further notes illustrates different aspects of Joyce's creative practices at work. Just below it, Léon noted another fact about the history of Tehran in the encyclopedia that reads, there are 12 gates, which are closed from 2 hours after sunset to an hour before sunrise. Again, a straightforward fact. The first part of the note Joyce had Léon record was quite straightforward. Sunset closure gate, the second of the lines here. But then Joyce reconsidered the note's possibilities and had him write sun lay closure just below it. Interesting as its new formulation may have been, Joyce did not find a use for it in Finnegans Wake. Unsurprisingly, Joyce focused his attention on the entry on Dublin in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Some of the notes on Joyce's own city are completely unremarkable, like the simple phrase Greater Dublin, while others are more like the kind of punning that Stuart Gilbert criticized. For example, Joyce had Léon note the name of the Dublin suburb, Donnybrook, at the bottom of the notebook page. The Encyclopedia Britannica entry simply tells us that the Dublin suburb was, quote, celebrated for its former fair. Reconsidering its possibilities, Joyce then had Paul write the name as Donkeybrook, just below the earlier entry. Again, here we see what Gilbert was suggesting, that Joyce was interested in punning on names. Joyce did find a place for this note in Haveth Childers Everywhere, and we do find it in Finnegans Wake as, quote, to bray at by Clonsillys in Donkeybrook Fair. Once all the hard work was finally complete, Joyce wrote to Harriet Shaw Weaver, his patron and former publisher, on 18 March 1930. I finished the revision of the fragment for publication last night at 7, and I suspect my literary career at the same time. The revision of this last fragment has been a frightful job, extending over 2 months, day and night sometimes, till 1 in the morning, with 7 different people helping me to do 7 different parts of the labor. But of course, such a condition of affairs could not continue. But yet it did continue for the next 9 years, and the result was Finnegans Wake. All told, Paul took notes in this bulky 225-page notebook in just a month and a half. All told, Paul took more notes in this bulky 220-page notebook in just a month and a half, more than anyone except Joyce himself. It is no wonder that Paul considered himself one of the best informed readers of Joyce's newest work, and set about writing one of its first critical responses. His wife, Lucy, recounts an anecdote in her memoirs that reveals precisely what Paul found so captivating about his collaboration with Joyce. She tells us, those who knew my husband well often wondered why anyone as self-sufficient as he was, with serious interest in intellectual work of his own, should have been willing to devote so much time to Joyce. Frequently, when the question was put to Joyce, he would answer, I am most interested in watching Joyce's process of creation. He has me look up words in various languages, and his mental process and the metamorphosis of language he indulges in are most fascinating to witness. Beginning in November 1930, Joyce enlisted Paul Léon, Eugene Jolas, and Ivan Gau to review the French translation of Anna Livia Plurabelle, another fragment that would be incorporated in Finnegans Wake. The fragment itself, the translation itself, was initially prepared by Samuel Beckett and Alfred Perron. Along with Philippe Soupeau, Joyce met with Léon and Jolas in the Léon's apartment in Rue Casimir Perrier on Thursday afternoons. By mid-March, Joyce was finally satisfied with the text, and then it appeared in the May issue of La Nouvelle Revue Française. At the same time, Léon began to take on more responsibilities in the management of Joyce's business dealings with his publishers in Paris, London, New York, and around the world. Joyce also tasked Léon to be his intermediary with his London agent and his solicitor, and assisted the Joyces as they managed the most basic aspects of their daily lives in Paris and abroad. When away from Paris, Joyce and Léon kept in touch by means of letters and telegrams, but more often than not, they simply spoke on the phone, which may explain why the surviving letters between them are usually very brief, and sometimes they're simply lists of instructions regarding the massive correspondence Joyce relied on Paul to carry out on his behalf. Most of Joyce's letters revolve around the same topics: difficulties with publishers, requests for money to be sent to him, instructions on paying bills, other errands Léon should run, Joyce's health, as well as the weather, wherever he happened to be vacationing. Besides taking care of all of Joyce's commissions, Léon continued to engage in his own scholarly pursuits throughout the 1930s. At the start of the decade, his monograph entitled Benjamin Constant was published. Then, just as Finnegans Wake was finally ready in 1939, he collaborated with Nikolai Timachev on a French translation of his Introduction to the Sociology of Law. So as you can see, Léon had very different intellectual interests from James Joyce, but nonetheless, he was willing to, in effect, collaborate with Joyce on his great project of trying to produce something quite different in literature, Finnegans Wake. Paul was also the Deputy Secretary General of the Archive of Philosophy of Law and Sociology and Legal Sociology from 1930 until he resigned in 1940, during which time he published 5 major studies of Rousseau in his journal. Busy as Léon was with his own intellectual pursuits, Joyce continued to rely on his friends and on his friend and confidant to run innumerable errands for him, both while he was in Paris and when he was away on his working holidays across Europe. He entrusted Paul to keep everyone updated on his itinerary, usually with a view to having them send advances and royalty payments as urgently as possible. In 1931, Joyce also signed a contract for the publication of Work in Progress in London and New York. At the time, no one could have predicted how onerous an ordeal getting Finnegans Wake into print would be for the writer and everyone else around him involved in this monumental endeavor. Over the next 8 years, Joyce had bursts of productive activity that were usually followed by prolonged periods of writer's block, especially when its creative and emotional energy was focused on his family, as well as on his own precarious health. As he became more preoccupied with his daughter Lucia's well-being, the mid-1930s were the most difficult years of Joyce's personal life, as well as his professional life. To everyone concerned, it seemed that what turned out to be Joyce's final work would remain in progress forever. In 1932, Léon took center stage in the management of Joyce's publishing affairs, when on the writer's behalf he began to pressure Sylvia Beach to publish yet another Shakespeare and Company impression of Ulysses. Given the impending publication of the book in America, as well as her own financial and personal concerns, Beach rightly refused. Ultimately, a concerted effort by Joyce's circle of friends and admirers convinced Beach to give up her publishing rights and thus almost all her financial interest in the book. On 9 February 1932, Paul introduced himself to T.S. Eliot in the following way, quote, "I'm acting as lawyer for Mr. Joyce in Paris." Once Shakespeare and Company was no longer the sole publisher of Ulysses, Léon worked tenaciously to ensure that Joyce's most lucrative work should be published in Britain, America, and around the world. As Joyce focused more of his time and energy on Lucia's welfare, Léon effectively took charge of Joyce's legal and financial negotiations with both his current and prospective publishers, often meeting with them in his apartment, reviewing contracts, offering advice both to the writer as well as to the publishers, and always ensuring that the author's advances and royalties were paid in full and as quickly as possible. Given his legal training, Léon quickly became an expert in the complexities of international copyright laws, especially as they pertain to Ulysses and then Work in Progress. For the final decade of Joyce's life, virtually anyone who wanted to reach him came to realize that the best and often only way to do so was through Paul Léon. It became quite routine for Léon to reply to correspondence addressed to Joyce. In fact, while there are hundreds of letters from Léon to the various publishers, only a few dozen of Joyce's own letters to his other business correspondents survive. Besides dedicating so much of his time and efforts to the management of the practical matters related to Joyce's works, Léon became Joyce's closest friend and a bulwark against the mounting difficulties the entire Joyce family faced in the 1930s. As the years went on, Joyce increasingly withdrew from almost all personal, social, and professional interactions, even with Harriet Shaw Weaver, his publisher, patron, and his most caring friend since 1914. At times, Joyce simply stopped writing to Weaver at all. Therefore, she increasingly relied on Léon to keep her posted on what was happening with the Joyces, which he did tirelessly. Léon and Weaver worked together to solve the complex practical and emotional issues that Joyce and his family faced. It also fell to Paul to ask Weaver to intervene with Joyce's solicitors so that he could draw upon the capital that she had bequeathed to him, against their more sensible advice not to do so. For almost a decade, Léon kept Weaver abreast of Joyce's health, work, and shifting moods, and the family's always uncertain financial situation. Her concern for Joyce naturally extended to the health and well-being of Joyce's daughter, Lucia. Léon's letters to Weaver chart the ups and downs of Lucia's condition and its psychological, emotional, and material impact on the family, particularly the consequences that caring for his daughter had on Joyce's ability to continue writing. In one letter after another, Weaver expressed her gratitude to Léon for keeping her informed, as well as for enjoining her to persist in her efforts to assist Joyce. She knew better than anyone else outside the Joyce family how important his presence was in the writer's life. On St. Patrick's Day 1934, she wrote to Léon, "I'm greatly obliged to you for your long and very full letter, and also for your suggestion that I should write directly and frankly to Mr. Joyce. I have done so and shall be posting the letter today with this one. I think I should never have written to him had you not urged it, believing as I did that he still would not wish to hear from me. I have stressed the points that you suggest, but greatly doubt whether the letter will carry anything at all of the weight you think it may. If anyone has been a good and true friend to Mr. Joyce, it is yourself." Towards the end of the year, Weaver confided her views about Joyce's state to Paul. "I think, too, that you are right in your belief that constant alternations of hope and despair mean an altogether too nerve-wracking strain for Mr. Joyce, with his extremely sensitive nature, and that a definite verdict about Lucia Joyce's condition and treatments would be the best in the end for him, and also for Mrs. Joyce, who you think is now more able to bear it. All the same, one cannot expect them not to cling desperately to this last hope thrown out by the last doctor to see her, Dr. Jung. In fact, I suppose they ought not entirely to give up hope while this last shred of it remains. But if only they would come away, leaving their daughter in the charge of Dr. Jung while this last experiment is tried." And certainly the financial situation, in view of the bad outlook for the future, is very serious. Even large American royalties will soon melt away, and English ones on Ulysses. Mr. Joyce says, are to be reduced. And English ones on Ulysses, Mr. Joyce says, are to be reduced, if ever they do materialize. I imagine that Mr. Joyce's Johannesburg stock must be rapidly approaching an exhaustion point. At this stage in Joyce's life, he was spending all of his resources from royalties and from the investment that Harriet Shaw Weaver had made on his behalf on Lucia Joyce's treatments, most of which were in Switzerland and various sanatoria there. The letter continues. P.S. I do not suppose Mr. Joyce will write to me himself in his present state, so that if you would let me know any further definite news, I should be very grateful. Although many other hurdles would still have to be overcome before Finnegans Wake finally appeared, Joyce finally began to make a real effort to finish the book in 1936. At this juncture, Paul shared the writer's optimism that the book would be finished soon. In fact, Joyce continued to work steadily throughout 1936 and 1937. But the expectation that the book would appear on Joyce's father's birthday on 4 July 1938 proved to be unrealistic. Meanwhile, Léon's scholarly work continued. Joyce must have realized the importance of Léon's intellectual engagements and was certainly aware of the extent to which his incessant demands on his friends took away from the time and effort Léon could devote to his own critical writings, as well as to his own family. Nonetheless, as usual, Joyce left the messy details of communicating with publishers to Léon. Léon had serious concerns about Joyce's health. Nonetheless, he wrote another long letter to Weaver to say he had just dined with the Joyces. He started with the facts, but then confided one of the clearest statements of what he valued most about his friendship with Joyce. I found Mrs. Joyce terribly depressed as she sees herself now separated by insurmountable obstacles from her second child. In fact, I've never seen her as depressed as she was yesterday. As for Mr. Joyce, in spite of the 3 hours daily sleep, he does not look badly and is aloof, though not gay. His work is apparently his principal preoccupation, as always, and he chooses it to hide whatever pain he may feel in his heart. Then Léon shared the good news that Joyce had arranged to get the Austrian writer Hermann Brock to England, and that he was busily writing letters to secure travel permits for several other Austrians who were trying to emigrate as well. Léon declared that Joyce's incessant effort in these matters, quote, throws quite a new light on Mr. Joyce's attitude. He conceded that it is understandable, perhaps, that anyone who tries to grapple seriously with the many serious problems, social, economic, and political, which harass the world today, will deplore what may seem the purposeless triviality of his writings and the inconsequent wastefulness of certain of his habits. And both these judgments may be very sound and matter of fact. This letter shows that after almost a decade of hard work assisting Joyce with his work in progress, Léon was still not fully convinced of its artistic merit. But he quickly qualified his overall judgment by adding that Joyce's actions as a person, quote, however, are apparently not inconsistent with a very active intervention when appealed to on behalf of people who suffer the hardships and perils of the two new devouring idols. Presumably, he means fascism and communism. Léon concludes, quote, that this activity must reconcile us to an outward indifference which combines with, quote, Joyce's exceptional qualities of the heart and his tenacity to do whatever he can to be of help to a human being. So what we see here is that Léon is able to see a distinction between the effort and time that Joyce puts into writing, what to some may seem trivial or wasteful at a time of great political upheaval, what became Finnegans Wake, and Joyce as a person who always seemed to find time to help a friend or someone who appealed to him on a personal level. Finally, on 13 November 1938, Joyce announced that he had finally completed his work in progress. Unsurprisingly, just a month later, he collapsed in the Bois de Boulogne due to years of overwork and stress. Léon let Weaver know that, quote, happily the collapse did not last, but of course he has not stopped working, as the doctors had advised. In fact, there was a lot more to be done to get the book into print. The number and kinds of additions and changes Joyce wanted made on the various settings of proofs were even greater than those for Ulysses 17 years earlier. A noted scholar has described Paul as, quote, the one person without whom Joyce's last book would never have been finished at all. There we are. Here we see the final page proofs of Finnegans Wake, with additions in Paul Léon's hand at Joyce's dictation, with Joyce's trademark green ink pen. When Joyce and Léon had fled Paris, they spent several weeks together in Saint-Géran-le-Puy. It was during this time that the two friends reread Finnegans Wake together. Surprisingly, carefully on the lookout to spot errors that may have crept in during the intense sessions when the writer and his press gang volunteers were working on the typescripts and proofs. For many years, Joyce had also charged Léon with keeping track of and ultimately sending his manuscripts to Harriet Shaw Weaver in London for safekeeping. Then after Joyce's death, with Paris occupied by the German army, Léon performed another final, even more significant act of personal and professional devotion. It would be hard to exaggerate the courage and dedication Léon showed in salvaging Joyce's books and manuscripts from the writer's last apartment. And if it had not been for Paul's selfless act, what we know about Joyce's works and his life would have been substantially diminished. Throughout his life, Joyce was usually quite careless about whether he happened to keep his own correspondence. On the other hand, dedicated as always, Léon meticulously retained and sorted all of the letters related to Joyce in his possession. He organized this mass of documents and entrusted them to Count O'Kelly, the Irish special counselor of the Paris and Brussels legations at the time. Then Joyce died suddenly in Zurich on 13 January 1941. And Paul Léon was murdered by the Nazis on 4 April 1942. In accordance with Paul's wishes, the papers in the National Library of Ireland remained sealed until they were open to the public for research purposes exactly 50 years to the day after his death. After the war, there was a spectacular Joyce exhibition in Paris with all the precious artifacts that Paul had rescued from the Joyce apartment. Its goal was to put the entire collection up for auction to benefit Joyce's widow, Nora, his son, Giorgio, and his daughter, Lucia Joyce, who is still institutionalized. The collection was acquired by what is today the poetry collection of the University at Buffalo, New York, where it became the foundation of their unrivaled Joyce archive. Similarly, Lucy, Paul's wife, kept the Léon's Joyce collection in their family apartment, and it was acquired by the University of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the 1980s. 20 years later, as as he sorted through their belongings that had been packed away in storage for decades, Paul and Lucy's son, Alexis Léon, found what they describe as, quote, a package wrapped in paper with something in Russian written on it that was held together with just a piece of string. In it was the largest and most significant collection of Joyce's manuscripts to have surfaced in 50 years. They are now known as the Joyce 2002 papers, and some of its highlights are Joyce's early Paris Pola commonplace book, as well as 16 copybook drafts of Ulysses, as well as previously missing miscellaneous Finnegans Wake manuscripts. Together with the James Joyce Paul Léon collection and the papers of Paul and Lucy Léon, they make the National Library of Ireland the most significant and extensive Joyce collection in Europe. While Ireland did not repatriate Joyce's body from its final resting place beside his wife Nora in Zurich's Flutern cemetery, the Léon family has over 2 generations ensured that his writerly remains have finally come home to Ireland. Thank you very much.
Well, Luca, thank you so much for that fascinating paper. So we've got time for questions. We have an audience online and lots of people in the room. So let's open it up. Would anyone like to start? Have an opening question? Yes, Sean?
Well, it's a fascinating human story. But you did highlight the big puzzle here. Here's somebody whose intellectual interests seem to be firmly placed in classical works, studies of Benjamin Constant and so on. And yet Andrew even seems to refer to the purposes of triviality of Joyce's work. Was he interested in other experimental and modernist writers of that era? Or was it he just make an exception purely for Joyce and personal interest?
He made an exception for Joyce. Joyce had a very charismatic personality. It seemed that he had a certain innate magnetism about him. When he met people, they were fascinated by what he had to say, what he was doing, and they slowly became absorbed into his orbit. And because of Joyce's poor health, his very poor eyesight, he often press-ganged them to do work for him. Now, I should amplify my answer. Léon entered the circle around Joyce of poets and writers, many of whom were associated with Shakespeare and Company. Many of them were writing experimental works, but Léon didn't show any active interest in reading their works, and certainly none in assisting them. What I find so fascinating is the fact is how Léon found so much time, was able to separate all that he did for Joyce. And we're talking about answering several letters a day from publishers, from Joyce himself, from numerous friends who couldn't contact Joyce, and taking care of Joyce's finances. And then it was also extraordinarily productive. One of the things I tried to show in our book was that his intellectual life did not come to a standstill when he worked with Joyce. Instead, he carved out time to further his intellectual interests and his career. Throughout the 1930s, he was considered a world-renowned authority. He edited a magazine, an international magazine, a very well-respected international magazine. He went to conferences. He had a prolific correspondence with intellectuals throughout Europe. One wonders how he found time to do all this in one day.
How did he himself make a living?
Léon did not work. He had family resources. So the family, when they emigrated from Russia, took money, possessions. When they moved to London, they moved into the Kensington Hotel. So they were wealthy families on both sides, but money like that quickly evaporates. Although Paul refused to accept any money from James Joyce or anyone else whom he helped with his legal services, his wife Lucy got a job. She was a well-respected fashion journalist. She had also an independent life and career, and she was also the family's breadwinner, something that was clear to their son Alexis Léon.
Okay, Mark?
That was amazingly interesting. You at one point say that Léon expresses doubt as to the absolute importance of the project of Finnegans Wake. Is there any point at which he expresses confidence in it, or do we know any more about his views, or what did you think about it as a project?
That's a very good question. I was stunned to find this letter. To almost everyone else, certainly anyone in the outside world, Léon was Joyce's most committed defender of his work. He kept telling everyone it's not a waste of time. Joyce knows exactly what he's doing. He's working tremendously hard all the time. But I believe that Léon was also a political philosopher. And when he weighed on balance the kind of energy and dedication other people were putting into political action and what Joyce was doing, he saw a disparity. By the way, I don't believe he ever expressed this doubt to Joyce himself. And even after he expressed this doubt to Harriet Shaw Weaver, he was unrelenting in his support of Joyce as they continued to work together to get Finnegans Wake ready. And then even once it's in print, to ensure that it's corrected, whatever that might mean. So but we should also remember that Léon, although a great historian and a philosopher of sociology, was also a highly abstract intellectual himself. He wrote on the theory of, on political theory, historical accounts of political theory. So he too was not actually engaged in any political activities, which is one of the reasons he and so many others found it so surprising that he was picked up along with so many other Jewish lawyers by the Nazis. He kept saying, I'm apolitical. I've never joined a group of any kind. I've never expressed a view in writing about current political affairs. Those pleas were ignored.
So you mentioned that Léon, before he leaves Russia, has this early interest in Ireland through
Yes.
the study of the legality, the legal issues around home rule.
Yes.
Does he ever visit Ireland himself? Does he take that interest?
No, he never did. In fact, Joyce never came back after he met Léon. Never came back after 1912. No. But what I found so interesting is that Joyce would make Léon read all sorts of books about Irish history. So whatever came Joyce's way, he would have people read to him, for him. Joyce believed in serendipity. He gave books to other people and said, take some notes on it and send it back. They said, what would you like to know? So for example, he gave a book in German to Beckett, and Beckett took very precise, he gave him an academic precise of the book. That's not at all what Joyce wanted. He wanted unusual scholarly words that he could pilfer and transform in one way or another for his purposes in Finnegans Wake. So although Joyce never returned to Ireland, he was always fixated by it. He read stacks of Irish newspaper from Dublin and from around the country every day. And we've been able to follow Joyce's interest in Irish politics through his note-taking. He also read classical works on Irish history and the latest books published. But what we might find unusual is that Joyce didn't pursue these interests in what we would consider an academic way, a scholarly way. He would buy books that happened to be published in 1928, for example. He just bought a stack of books and he read them, but probably not the way you and I would read them. He would skim them. He often, we can tell from the notebooks, read books backwards, chapter by chapter, because he wasn't looking for the author's argument, but rather the ways in which the various writers took up the questions of that they were interested in and the words that they would use.
Look, any questions online? Nothing so far. Other questions from the floor? Anyone like to ask anything?
Yes, please, Margaret.
You said that you know, he read a lot of Irish newspapers.
Absolutely.
I knew he read material, you know, that Frank Hallidan's written about, United Irishmen,
Yes.
Griffith's papers. Did he read Irish newspapers in the 20s and 30s?
Absolutely, he subscribed. So when Joyce was poor and stuck in Zurich, for example, he had his uncle Michael Healy send him bundles of newspapers. He didn't care how old they were. And what we found most interesting, it's not just Dublin papers. Joyce wanted regional papers. For example, someone has discovered that Joyce was reading the Connacht Tribune. And what he was interested in was the language. And he particularly liked, there's a certain way in which criminal proceedings are treated in Irish newspapers. He liked the roundabout way in which newspapers discussed serious matters. One of the things that we found most interesting is that Joyce is reading Irish newspapers all around the period of independence, and he was obviously reading all of the political news, but he didn't take notes on any of those things. Instead, he would note down recipes. He liked letters to the editor because they were in the person's own voice. And so Joyce was not really looking for facts. I'm sure he absorbed these facts along the way, but he was looking for the way in which people articulated opinions and facts, the way in which they articulated their impressions, opinions, and he would borrow them. One of the ways in which Joyce described Finnegans Wake was the last word in stolen telling. So he would borrow other people's words and do something quite different
The
with
last
it.
word in?
Stolen telling. Stolen telling instead of storytelling. Because he would steal from other people. So we often think of the artist as someone who creates out of nothing. Joyce is this great genius, and all of his Ulysses just appeared out of nowhere. Not true at all. Joyce read read constantly. Half of Joyce's writing life was spent reading. And what he was looking for was literally words. He had a category in his notebook called words. And he would just make lists and lists of other people's words. And then when he found a word that he liked, he would take it out, cancel it, and use it in his book. He would cancel it because he thought, there are more than enough words in the world. I'll just use it once.
Luca, you told us that the Léon collection of Joyce manuscripts was finally released to the public domain 50 years after his death, so it's 1992.
Exactly.
So what impact does that have on Joyce studies once that material becomes available? Is it transformative?
It should have been, but it came. It's so large that it hasn't been adequately absorbed. One of the things my book and other work that I do has tried to show is that a lot of work needs to be done. It's a huge amount of information. Many scholars are interested in Joyce's own letters, what Joyce wrote at the period. But in the 1930s, Joyce didn't write that many letters, certainly not as many as he wrote in the 1920s or in the teens when he was managing his own affairs. Joyce wanted to insulate himself from the world so that he could have all of his attention focused on his work and his family. Well, that means that Joyce's voice is being mediated by all these other people. What I'm trying to do is encourage other people to read the letters in the Joyce circle to find out more about James Joyce, as I hope I tried to show in this paper. So the conversations between Joyce, two of Joyce's closest friends, allies, supporters, Harriet Shaw Weaver and Paul Léon, are an invaluable resource, and they will be transformative. The last 10 years of Joyce's life have been barely explored, and that's what, because
30 years on from the release.
Yeah.
Good. Any other questions?
Just on that note, more stuff continues to appear all the time.
Can I ask one online?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
It's not really a question, but it's partly question, partly comment. Can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Two things. It seems incredible to me. It seems absolutely almost unbelievable to me that Léon, a man with such foresight and insight and knowledge and means, did not attempt to escape from the Nazis. When, for instance, I think you stated that James Joyce was helping some other people who were trying to escape, and yet here was Léon, who had contacts abroad, he had the money, he had the means, and other people were desperately trying to escape from the Nazis. It seems very strange that he had that blind spot.
A blind spot's a very good way to put it. There's a certain amount of naivete on the Léon family's. Did I cut you off?
No, I can hear you.
Okay, so the Léon family showed a certain amount of naivete to return. On the one hand, Lucy Léon wanted to learn because wanted to return because she could take up her job again. But
Yes.
quite another thing for Paul Léon to return with their son to Paris. One of the things we have to keep in mind was that Alexis Léon, the son, needed to take his baccalaureate exams, and they naively thought that things were safe enough for them to return.
Yes.
And but Paul Léon actually complied and wore a yellow star around the city, so he must have realized the danger he was in.
Yes.
He was a very idealistic man. He believed that the world couldn't be so crazy as to persecute a man like himself, who had never uttered a political word in his life, who had only wanted to dedicate his life to scholarship.
Yes.
And he went at night back to Joyce's flat to take things away, salvage things from the flat, which otherwise would have been lost to history. He went twice, and then his wife, when he returned home, his wife said, did you get everything? And he said, no, there's too much. And she said, why don't you go back? And Paul looked at his wife and he said, do you know what you're asking me to do? So put my life in danger.
Yes.
This is something I didn't want to explore too much in this talk, but when Paul was picked up by the Nazis, he wrote to his wife and he said, it's all a mistake. I'll be out in no time. It's just a clerical error.
Yes.
Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. But of course, as time went on, he began to realize that things were not, these errors were eating up lots and lots of people, were devouring them, and he started to realize that he was probably not going to survive. And throughout his incarceration, his primary interest was his own family, his wife, his child, but he never forgot about James Joyce's works and his family. On the anniversary of Lucia Joyce's, her birthday, he says, please ask Beckett to send her 100 francs in his father's name, so her father's name. And he did so. Léon believed that after he got out of these detention camps, that he could get back to his own work. And he also planned to write a scholarly study of James Joyce in Finnegans Wake.
Yes.
Of course, the events got ahead of Léon, and he was transferred to Auschwitz, Birkenau. And he was unable to continue the journey, and he was simply shot dead on one of the earlier legs of the forced march. It took decades for Lucy Léon to get confirmation of his murder, but she finally did, and that must have been a relief to her.
Yes, so that was absolutely tragic. The other thing that I wanted to say is, I suppose from our viewpoint nowadays, we would say that Joyce was narcissistic, and that he was narcissistic enough to use others and charismatic enough to draw them, as you said, into his orbit, as you stated. But his narcissism, in one way, I mean, it was kind of a quiet narcissism, or could it be described as such, gave him supreme confidence in his own ability and his aims and ambitions, and of course that ultimately sustained his ambition and endeavours throughout all the ferocious difficulties that he had for most of his life, and the lack of money and all the things he had to struggle with. But it's that what would we say, cross thing that, you know, he had the charisma. And I think you often find that in people who rise to the surface, who become famous, that you have charisma and you have narcissism, and that balance between them, if you know, can sustain and bring a person to the forefront. And I wonder if it's a thing where a child is given a lot of attention as a child because they're very clever, and that gives them the confidence to sustain them no matter what difficulties come across their way. Would you like to comment on that? Or...
Well, that was very well said. I agree with everything. I agree with everything you said. Well put. Let's unpack this word narcissism. Now, yes. Joyce was a very self-centered person, but it wasn't simply about himself. It was himself so that he could do his work as an artist. Yes. He was supremely confident and dedicated to his work. Now, he expected everyone to have the same dedication that he had. Now, when first with Ulysses, certainly, he was convinced that he had to finish the book. And then with the long gestation of Finnegans Wake, 16 years, when so many people were unsupportive, Joyce never gave up his determination, his confidence in what he was doing. And maybe history will prove him to be correct. But from a personal standpoint, he left he asked a lot from many different people. Yes. Chances are I wouldn't want to be James Joyce's friend.
Yes.
Well, but nonetheless, but I don't need to be his friend. I study his works. Yes. And he has left us an incredible legacy through his artistic dedication and skill.
Yes. There's an Irish saying, Aithne and Kirog Ella, which means one cockroach recognizes another. Now, I'm not being derogatory in the slightest, but it seems to me that Joyce recognized Léon as having the same tenacity and the same dedication and the same, of course, cleverness and ability, and that is why he became his friend, and of course then, you know, used, I don't mean used in a nasty sense, but was able to use him and could draw upon him so much, and the ability was there to do all of the things that Joyce needed. But Aithne and Cearog Ella applies, I think. Joyce recognized that in Léon from the start.
I agree completely. Both Joyce, and although very different, Joyce and Léon were extraordinarily dedicated intellectuals.
Yes.
They and very dedicated family men as well. So they had, although they came from different backgrounds and had very different interests, they had a fundamental bond that made them friends for over a decade. Arguably, Léon was Joyce's closest friend throughout his entire life.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that contribution. Any other questions? Okay, so I mean, if this has, Margaret, of course.
Do you think he was his closest friend?
I would say so. Closest personal friend, yeah. Besides his brother, outside of his own, outside of Joyce's own family, Paul Léon was probably his closest friend. The only person with whom he would discuss intimate details about his family. So Joyce was an extremely reticent person about himself and his family life, but he spoke frankly to Léon, and I think that he found it quite refreshing that Léon spoke frankly to him about what he thought Joyce should do.
Thank you. So, if the wonderful paper that Luca has given to us this afternoon has sparked your interest, I would recommend you to look at the edition that Luca co-edited with Alexis and Anna Maria Léon, James Joyce and Paul L. Léon, The Story of a Friendship Revisited, published by Bloomsbury last year in 2022. And you'll find many of the documents you spoke about this afternoon and many more of interest in that collection. Can I ask you to thank Luca for coming and speaking to us this afternoon?
You're very welcome.
Thank you. It's been great. We do have an Irish Studies seminar next Monday, same time, 4:30. It'll be myself speaking about Charles Gavin Duffy and land reform in Ireland and colonial Victoria, 1850 to 1880, rather different topic. But if that interests you, please come on at 4:30 and we'll see you then. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for an excellent question and answer.